Hi, I'm Adam and welcome back to First Man Photography, and in today's video I'm going to share 7 things that often seem like secrets, but they're tools we can use to unlock the potential in us and our photos. Before we get going today though, this video is sponsored by Squarespace. If you need a domain name, a website, or an online store, make your next move with Squarespace. We now live in a world where almost everyone is taking pictures with their phones, but the truth is, the vast majority of these are nothing more than snapshots really, that no one will ever see. One way to lift yourself above the noise is to be intentional, and rather than just capturing a quick picture, we can think about it like an artist. The 4 walls of our frame are like a blank canvas, and what you place on it is entirely up to you. So by employing the same tricks that a painter would use, we can carefully craft a photograph into something beautiful, and I would bet probably that you've already heard of a few of these, but let's bring them all together and make sense of these artistic elements. When we pick up a pencil to doodle on a piece of paper, every single time, even if it turns out to be a masterpiece, we begin by drawing a single line. Lines form the basis of all the other artistic elements, and this is pretty obvious when you're drawing or painting, but with photography, where everything is essentially captured at the same time, it's not quite as straightforward, but lines are still a good place to begin. Let's use a landscape as an example. In many scenes, one of the most obvious lines we will need to deal with is the horizon. Now, horizontal lines can create a calming and secure feeling, and certainly looking off into the distance at the horizon, I think, does this. Now, we are in control of where we place the horizon in our frame, and putting it along the line of the rule of thirds rather than through the middle of the frame can often produce more pleasing results. Vertical lines give an impression of strength and power, and this is often used to great effect in cityscapes or photographing architecture. A word of caution here though, it's very easy to shoot vertical structures and unintentionally, but maybe subconsciously, portray a sense of male power with a phallic feel. You may have heard of leading lines, and that's because lines can also be used to create a sense of depth or movement in our photographs. It can be something physical that guides the eye through the scene, like the wall in this image. It doesn't have to be a straight line either. It can be an S-curve like the rocks in this seascape. And it can be more of an imaginary line as well that isn't necessarily something tangible, but it's kind of the invisible line along which our eye travels through when we look at an image. And this can often be created with light. Next we have shape, and these are the 2D objects in our scene. Now with photography we very rarely actually capture the artistic element of shape because almost everything in the real world is 3D. But for a masterclass of how shape can be used in photography, check out the work of Charlie Waite, where these sort of photographs demand your attention way longer than you might expect just at first glance. Charlie also wrote the foreword to my book, so it's always nice to give him a plug, but be sure to go down below and check that out. Now, we see the world in 3D thanks to our binocular vision, but as we start to look further into the distance, we lose some of that information. So many distant objects will appear 2D. As photographers, we can use this to our advantage by attaching a longer lens and using shape to create interesting photographs that have a very flat but interesting feel. Shapes can be geometric, like this scene here of the harbour wall, where I've also carefully placed the lines of that ladder, which I think gives the image a more powerful feel amongst all the horizontal lines travelling across the frame. Shapes can also be organic, like in this scene here, where the snowy monochromatic conditions have removed almost all of the 3D information, and we're just left with what I think are the fascinating shapes of the mountain and distant tree, and they're created by the snow covering the rest of the scene. Most of the time when photographers talk about the shape in their image, what we are actually talking about is form, or the 3D objects in our scene. In photography, dealing with form is one of our biggest challenges. It's why woodland photography is so difficult. When we're actually stood there in the wood, our binocular vision can make sense of that 3D environment. We can see the depth and the distance between the trees, and it all looks spectacular. But as photographers, our job is to bring that 3D world down into the 2D world. And for anyone that has ever tried to photograph a wood, it's all too easy to make it look like a busy mess. So one of our main tasks is to remove attention from distracting forms and place it onto another form that will likely be our subject. So fog in a woodland scene simplifies the background and deals with the distracting forms of the distant trees. With portraits, we use a shallow depth of field to remove the background and place emphasis on our model. We can use light on a subject or adjust our perspective up and down to separate things from their background. I love using long exposures in my landscape photography to smooth out water because personally, I find the forms created by the ripples and reflections quite off-putting, and it allows me to create a more serene feel and send the attention to the static objects in the scene. ICM is also popular, and what that does is essentially remove all form from an image and turns it into organic shape. Now, before we look at the next 4 things, as you know, this video is sponsored by Squarespace. And Squarespace is just the best place for photographers to build their website. And that's because it's just so easy to do. You start by using one of their beautiful templates, put some of your images on and a bit of your text, and then before you know it, you will have a unique and beautiful looking website. You don't need any coding knowledge either, and it will dynamically adjust to look perfect on all types of screens, including a phone. As you grow, you can then upgrade your site to an online store where you can just really easily start selling prints, books, or anything else that takes your fancy. It also now has a member section if you want to run a subscription service, and in the unlikely event that you run into trouble, they have award-winning customer service. I've used Squarespace for many, many years and have never looked back. So go to squarespace.com to start your free trial today, and if you like what you have created, then use the offer code FIRSTMAN to get 10% off your first purchase. When an artist with a brush is faced with that blank canvas, one of their biggest challenges is creating the illusion of space in a flat 2D world. In photography, this is not as difficult because we're literally capturing that space with our cameras, so we don't need to think about making distant objects small and closer objects look larger. But we should consider how much space various elements of our scene take up in the frame. The artistic element of space is what lies between, around, or within an object, and we can adjust this by moving around and changing our perspective or using a different focal length. So say if our subject is a lone tree and we want to fill our frame with it, we could move closer to it and use a wide angle lens to make the tree big in our frame and the distant mountains seem very small. Alternatively, we can move back away from the tree, zoom in with a longer lens to still fill the frame, but then thanks to lens compression, the mountains will then feel larger too. Neither way is wrong, but it's just about managing our tools to use the space in our frame with creative intent. We also have negative space, which is generally the area around our subjects, and that can be used also to create these kind of minimalist images. Negative space is just as important because if you don't pay attention to it, unintended objects can creep in and spoil your image by taking the viewer's attention away from the positive space or subject where you want that attention to be. This is why we say check around the edge of your frame and consider what to exclude from it as much as you want to include in your frame. It can also be important to leave enough negative space between our subject and the edge of the frame. This is when we describe it as giving things space to breathe, because otherwise it can feel very restrictive if my head starts to go off the top of the screen. Value is how light or dark something is in our photograph, from absolute black to absolute white. The painter uses value to create shading to make things look 3D, but as photographers, this is down to our lighting. So if we are planning an image, we need to think about the time of day we're shooting, the direction, what the weather's like, or artificial lights like flashes we might want to use. This is really the bread and butter of photography, and also ties in with our technical skills to be able to capture perfect exposure. And value also plays a big part in post-processing and was the basis of Ansel Adams's zone system. I think I could make a whole video about this one element, but it's important to know that brighter and more contrasty areas of your photograph will demand more attention than darker parts. Like my face here is brighter than the background. This is also why we might dodge and burn sections of an image to increase the differences in value and make that area more prominent. Also, just remember, in most landscapes, the sky will be brighter than the bottom of the frame or scene. So if you flip that in post, it can start to look unrealistic. Quite often I will add a gradient filter to darken off the bottom of the frame, which helps make it feel realistic and also guide the eye through the image. Colour is the next one, and probably the thing that makes the biggest impact when we first look at an image, because colour's so tied up with how we feel. One of the things I particularly love about landscape photography is how the colour changes during the seasons, and having the privilege to shoot these places in all their different guises. In photography, colour I think is interesting because it's so different depending on genre. If you control the colour of your subject, you can make very careful colour decisions at the time of shooting. But as landscape photographers, that's dictated to us by the location and the elements. Regardless, it's still a vital part of our photography. We also have a large amount of control over colour in post-production, especially using things like the hue, saturation, and luminance sliders. Again, there's way too much to go into here, but it's very helpful to understand that colours at opposite sides of the colour wheel will complement each other. And this is particularly good to know when your wife is getting ready and asks if the red top goes with the purple skirt. Then you just reply saying, "It's a really nice top, but I'd love to see you try the green one." Another point with colour, when we drag that saturation slider all the way to the left, we make it black and white. Now, sometimes we describe this as monochrome, but what monochrome really is white and varying shades of one other colour. And I have a real affinity for making blue monochrome images. So number 7 is texture, and in my experience, this is one photographers probably have the least control over because it's totally dependent on the subject that we shoot. I do, however, enjoy making more abstract images based on textures that intrigue me in the landscape. This is one of the barnacle-covered rock that I shot a couple of weeks ago, or here is one of the tree growing out of the lichen-covered rock that I think creates a kind of fascinating contrast of textures. One area of photography for me where texture does play a big part, though, is with printing, and particularly the type of paper we use. Just in the last video, I used a high gloss paper for that really reflective beach. And in fact, almost every time there is water in my scene, I will use at least a semi-gloss paper. All of my woodland images are then on smooth, matte cotton rag paper because the subtle texture of the paper seems to really match the scene. And sometimes I'll even go even further and use a paper with an etching that almost lifts the texture off the page. So there's a lot to take in there, and you could probably make a video about each individual element. But another benefit to learning these artistic elements is it will increase your appreciation of other people's work and also give you the means to talk about artwork and photography in an interesting way, describe it more clearly, and provide better critique. Anyway, please like the video, and there's links for nice things down below, including my book, and your support is greatly appreciated. Bye.